Hello, welcome back to Hydroponics Daily. Today I'm going to be talking about hormone powders or hormone gels. I think this is a really important subject to talk about because there are a lot of rubbish products on the market and you need to be really careful when you're getting into horticulture that you're using the right product. And also you need to determine whether you actually need a rooting gel or a rooting hormone at all. So why do I say that? Well, a lot of plants are really easy to root when you take a cutting. If you take the classic example of a tomato, I mean true tomatoes here, the ones that produce red fruit, then you put them in a glass of water and they will produce roots. They're really good at producing what we call adventitious roots. Adventitious roots are roots that form in places where they shouldn't normally form, normally on the side of a stem. And so a tomato, you don't need to use a rooting hormone. If anything, it's going to delay the growth of the plant, the subsequent cutting, because it's going to stimulate extra root production when it actually, once the roots are going, it probably wants to produce more stems. So don't research the plant you're going to grow and decide whether for cuttings you actually need a rooting powder. And so things like, I think basil's really easy to root as well. So tomatoes and basil, they'll even produce roots on sections of the stem where you wouldn't normally expect them to form for a cutting. So that's like between the nodes, the internodal sections, they'll actually form roots. And if you flood a tomato plant, you'll see roots appearing on the stem at the bottom of the plant. You'll think, oh, I've got such good root production. No, that's bad. If you've got roots forming at the bottom of the stem in a tomato plant, then you've done something wrong. And it's actually caused it to produce new roots so it can get some oxygen into the root system. So that's important to note. Also important to note, if you've got poor rooting on a plant anyway, and you think, oh, I could put some rooting gel or some rooting powder, dilute that down and pour it into the solution to get my root system going, don't do that. That's a quick way to just stop your plants from growing. You might even kill your plants. So rooting powders, rooting gels, they're strictly speaking just for use on the actual plant itself, just on the cutting itself. Don't put it on a rooted plant. And in fact, many of the hormones that are used in rooting gels are actually in weed killers. So things like 2,4-D and MCPA. These are actually weed killers, herbicides. When they're put in higher doses, you put them onto your lawn and then they kill the weeds, but not the grass, because grasses are less sensitive, far less sensitive to auxin hormones. So that's an interesting side note. So as I've just said there, these are auxin hormones. All the rooting gels that are registered around the world are all based on auxins. So normally it's either indole acetic acid, indole butyric acid, and they're IAA or IBA. There's also NAA, I think that's naphthal acetic acid. Don't quote me on that. NOA, as I said, 2,4-D and things like that. So normally it's IBA. IBA is similar to IAA, but it doesn't break down as quickly. And that's an important thing to consider. So there's a really good point about rooting hormones. Keep them in a cool, dry place. In horticultural nurseries, you'd normally have a dedicated fridge. So you wouldn't put them in a normal fridge because these are hormones and potentially toxic. So that's important. If it's a liquid, you do not want to put it in the light because auxins break down in the light. And even if they're stored in a fridge, you'll often find them stored in a brown glass jar, either a liquid or a completely opaque jar. So that's important to note. So the gels just make it easier for the hormone to get into the plant. They did used to do a powdered auxin, I think, was it BASF? Strike. Do you remember Strike? It had a yellow tub and then it had a green lid, and the lid was actually a dibber, so you could dip it into your grow media and make a nice hole for your cutting. A fantastic piece of product design, although I don't think Strike's available anymore. Might be in America, not in the UK. So things like Clonex are normally the market leader in both the UK and the US. That's a purple gel with IPA in it. And there are other products on the market. There are lots more in Canada, things like that. You can get big tubs of rooting gel and things like this. So a lot of them will contain these, but you need to be careful of the rooting gels and the rooting powders that you'll find in garden centres and hardware stores, things like in the UK, Poundland, Homebase, things like that, and they'll say natural rooting powder. And they might have a bit of seaweed extract in, but they won't have auxin. They won't have the synthetic auxin. They won't have the auxin that, they might have a bit of willow root and things like that, but they're not going to really be potent. It's a bit of a placebo effect. I wouldn't use them. I'd always look for something that contained, was active. Speak to your grow shop, see what they recommend. And certain crops need a higher dose rate. So if you go into a grow shop, the sort of crops that grow shops tend to cater for, they will have a higher auxin level in those rooting gels, and they normally have a pigment in them and things like that. So normally about 60 ml tubs, I think. So have a look at that. Don't buy the cheap and nasty rooting powders. They will be useless, and especially if they've sat on a hardware store or discount store's shelf for years and years and years, there'll be nothing in them anyway. So I've said on previous episodes, auxin is the hormone that's produced in the apical buds of stems and growing leaves that travels down through the stems. Polar auxin transport, it's called, and builds up at the cutting because it's not getting to the roots. It would normally form more roots, and so that stimulates the formulation of callus, which we've talked about before, undifferentiated cells that then will produce root primordia, and the roots will grow out from there. A bit like a traffic jam, it all builds up, and then it's suddenly the roots form because there's too much auxin there. And then you can bypass this process by putting a rooting gel on it. So something like a rhododendron cutting, you definitely need a rooting gel or a rooting powder because it's just such a slow process, and they wouldn't form adventitious roots on their own, and certainly not in internodal sections. One top tip is always to decant rooting gel or rooting powder into another vessel, and then dip your cuttings in it, and then throw that powder you were using away, especially if you're really worried about diseases being transferred from one plant to the other. So if you've got cuttings from a number of plants, maybe you've harvested them from a friend's grow room or things like that, and there's a number of plants, if you dip them all in the same one, then you could be transferring, if the first one had a virus, you could be transferring that virus to them all. If it had fusarium wilt, you could get fusarium wilt or verticillium wilt all over the rest of your plants. That's why you also sterilize any of your secateurs or snips that you're using to take cuttings. Some rooting gels might contain a fungicide to prevent this, and also to help protect your plants against root rot or just rot when they're in the damp, humid environment when you're trying to take the cuttings. There might also be zinc in your rooting powder, just because zinc is required for the synthesis of natural auxins, and so it helps with that. Zinc would also help to be a bit of a biofungicide, so not a biofungicide, just to kill fungi. And the actual vast majority of the rooting gel and rooting powder is water or talc or some sort of natural gel. It's only far less than 1% auxin because these are hormones. They're required in such very small amounts. You might be growing a perennial plant and a deciduous plant, and for these you have to take something called hardwood cuttings. You have to do a bit of research around what those are, but when you're taking a hardwood cutting, you have to use a far higher concentration of auxin than would be in the normal rooting gel and rooting powder. Rooting gels are normally designed for herbaceous plants and softwood cuttings, so you need to bear that in mind. You also have to be careful of any rooting liquids that contain a lot of alcohol on species such as roses and barberries, because berberis, that sounds like a tongue twister, because they are highly sensitive to alcohol. So you might want to use a rooting powder there, and then use the higher concentrations on things like Photinia, rhododendron, white fringe tree, which need a lot higher level of auxin to stimulate root production. Interesting fact, auxins were first isolated from human urine during the 1930s. Unfortunately, the concentration used for propagation is far lower than is found in human urine, so you can't use your own piss to propagate your cuttings. Don't try it. Organic growers could use willow rooting substance, which is made by taking young willow shoots, removing the leaves and then placing them in a small volume of water and steeping them for a day, and then putting that in the fridge. The drain liquid is used as you would any other rooting solution at the base of the cuttings. So as I say, it can be stored in the fridge, and it can be made with any variety of willow, so salix species. You'll find them down by the riverside, near a canal or near a lake. So despite the positive findings with willow rooting substance, or WRS, it's not as good as standard rooting liquids. And the few published scientific studies on the use of WRS have presented contradictory results on its effectiveness. So suck it and see, try it on your plant, see if it works. And remember, auxins do not stimulate growth in general, only the growth of adventitious roots. If you apply it to roots that are already there, it will inhibit their growth. So don't think of it as a rooting stimulator, or a root stimulator even. One interesting finding is that some plant species, you get improved rooting if you wound the base of the cutting before you put it into rooting gel. So this can be squeezing it, slitting it, doing anything like that will wound it and form wound tissue. This stimulates the formation of callus tissue, as I talked about before, and increases the surface area where roots can appear. This has been found to be effective in juniper, holly, thuja, which is I believe that's a conifer, rhododendron again, apple, and magnolia. And then they're normally quite difficult to take cuttings from. In fact, most conifers, you'll wound them as you take the needles off the stem anyway to actually make the cutting look suitable for it to be, reduce the surface area of leaf tissue down. So you'll get wounding anyway when you do that. However, most plant species, wounding is not adventitious, certainly not in herbaceous plants. So don't think of that as your go-to technique. In fact, you want to minimize wounding in many species. So make sure you've got a sharp craft knife or very sharp secateurs that are sterilized and ready to go. Don't use a craft knife on woody material because that's dangerous. It could, either snap, break, you could cut your finger off, things like that. So secateurs are always the best for woody material. And then again, even when you're using secateurs, be really careful of your fingers. If you're using a folding blade, make sure the inside of the receptacle is clean as well and free of plant material, because again, that's going to cause rotting and things like that if you dip back into rotted plant material. So that's something to consider. And you can always take 2 cuts. I always do this. If I'm taking plants cuttings, I'll always cut them actually in between the nodes, in the internode first, and then when I'm just about to put the cutting into the compost, the growing media, and then I will cut it just below the node, dip it in the rooting gel, then put it in the growing media, because that way you've got to remember that the cutting is transpiring, it's losing water all the time. As soon as you cut it off that plant, it's dehydrating. So that by cutting it at the internode, that allows some of that sap to sort of suck up into the stem, go a bit further up, and the air is moving up, and then you cut it again and you've got fresh sap there at the bottom, and then you put that into the growing media. You increase the humidity to 100%, put the lid on, and then that means that there's more sap in the total of that stem, as it were, if that makes any sense at all. But that's what I would do. And we've talked about air layering, things like that in the past. Sort of a cross between taking cutting and air layering is you can girdle the plant a week or 2 before you take the cutting, and then that helps the auxin build up because you've removed the outer bark or outer stem tissue and allowed the xylem, the water, to still flow into that cutting. And then you take it, and then that gives it a week or 2 more of auxin building up before you actually take it. This would only you'd only do that on really, really precious genetic material that you really wanted to preserve. You couldn't do that commercially on loads and loads of cuttings, but if you've got one plant you really need to rescue, then you could girdle before you take a cutting. If you need any more information about that, then please get in touch and I'm happy to discuss it further. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today, all about rooting hormones and rooting gels. Be careful of the products you use, make sure you actually need one. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click follow so that you don't just get this one episode and never hear from me again. Get loads more episodes. If you'd like to leave a review, that'd be fun-dabby-dozy. Until tomorrow, thank you very much for listening.